She thought she had married the most perfect man in the world, but that night, when she opened her forgotten laptop, she discovered that her loving husband had been stalking her since she was 17 years old. And that's not the worst. The worst part is, he knows she saw. If you love stories about betrayal, power, and bloody love, hit like and comment with the name of the city you're looking at so I know how far my story goes. Don't go anywhere, because from this moment, things will never be as you think. The insomnia had been Vivian's companion for 11 years, not the soft, manageable kind. Not the kind where you lie in bed and stare at the ceiling and eventually drift off somewhere around 3 in the morning. This was the industrial-grade variety, the kind that started behind her eyes around midnight and sat there like something with weight, something that breathed, until the sky outside the bedroom window went from black to the particular bruised gray that meant another night had been consumed and there was nothing to show for it, but a body that ached, and a mind that wouldn't stop moving. She had learned, over time, to make use of it. Most nights she worked. Case files, briefs, depositions that needed to be dismantled line by line until the weak spots showed themselves. Vivian Cross had built her reputation at Harwick and Associates on exactly this: the willingness to go further than anyone else was willing to go, to stay in the room with a problem until it broke open and gave up what it was hiding. She was 34 years old, and in 11 years of practice, she had put away 2 sitting aldermen, a state comptroller, and a federal judge who had been taking payments through a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands under his ex-wife's maiden name. The partners at Harwick called her relentless. Her clients called her the best money they'd ever spent. The people she went after called her other things entirely. She didn't mind. The names people called you when they were afraid of you said more about them than about you. Tonight she wasn't working. Tonight she was doing what she did on the nights when even the files couldn't hold her. Walking the apartment in the dark, barefoot on the cold hardwood, getting a glass of water she didn't particularly want. Standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor and watching Chicago burn below her the way it always burned, all lit glass and moving headlights and the distant, indefinite pulse of a city that never decided it was finished with the day. The apartment belonged to Damien. Everything here belonged to Damien. She had her own things. Her books, her case files, the battered coffee mug she'd had since law school that he'd offered twice to replace, and she'd refused both times. But the space itself was his. He had chosen it the way he chose everything, quietly, without apparent effort, as though the decision had already been made somewhere upstream and he was simply moving in the direction it pointed. Damien Valenti was like that. Decisive without visible deliberation, calm without visible effort. She had never in 4 years of marriage seen him raise his voice. She had never seen him startled or uncertain or caught off balance by something he hadn't accounted for. It was one of the things she had fallen in love with, in the beginning, that steadiness, that particular quality of stillness he carried, as though the noise of the world moved around him and left him untouched at the center. It was also, she had admitted to herself in the darker hours of certain sleepless nights, the thing about him she understood least. She told herself she was going to check the thermostat. The apartment ran cold. It always ran cold. Damien preferred it that way, and she had long ago stopped arguing the point. She moved down the corridor past the kitchen, past the closed door of the guest suite, past the wide arch that opened into Damien's private study, and she would have walked past that too except for the fact that the door was not quite closed, and through the gap she could see the pale blue glow of a laptop screen. She stopped. Damien never left his laptop open. She had known this about him for 4 years with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who had cataloged the habits of the man she lived with. He traveled with it, a matte black device she had never seen him use in her presence, always carried in a leather case, always locked, always put away before she entered a room where it sat. She had asked about it once, early in their marriage, and he had smiled and said it was for work, and she had accepted that the way you accepted small mysteries in a marriage, understanding that the alternative was to pull at threads and not know what you would unravel. She pushed the door open. The study was empty. Damien was not at the desk. The lamp was off. The only light in the room was the laptop screen, left open on the desk, the screensaver not yet activated, which meant he had been here recently, had stepped away for a minute, a bathroom break, a glass of water, something. He would be back. She stood in the doorway and looked at the screen. It showed a standard desktop interface. Nothing on the surface. No open documents, no browser windows, no indication of what he had been doing. Just a clean desktop with a single folder icon in the lower right corner, half hidden in the shadow of the taskbar. The folder had no name, just an icon. Vivian Cross was, at her core, a woman constitutionally incapable of leaving an unopened door unopened. She crossed the room. She sat down at the desk. She told herself she was going to close the laptop because that was the reasonable thing to do. The respectful thing. The thing a woman did when she found her husband had left his work computer unattended. She closed it and said nothing about it in the morning. That was the choice available to her. She clicked the folder. It opened into a subfolder structure 3 layers deep, and it took her a moment to understand what she was looking at, because nothing was labeled in any way that corresponded to language she expected. Numbers, dates, location codes formatted like shipping manifests. She clicked deeper and the files began to change shape. Spreadsheets first, dense with transactions that moved through holding companies she recognized as legitimate Chicago investment vehicles. Then through a second tier that didn't exist anywhere she could identify, then into a third tier that corresponded to nothing at all she had ever seen. She was an attorney who had spent years following money through the places money hid, and she could read a financial structure the way some people read a language. And what she was reading here was something that moved vast sums across at least a dozen jurisdictions in a pattern that was specifically designed to leave no traceable origin. She kept clicking. The photographs came next. Surveillance photographs, the kind taken from distance, with long lenses, in the particular flat, overexposed quality of professional surveillance work. Faces she didn't recognize. Locations she half recognized. A parking structure on the south side, a warehouse along the river, a marina she had driven past 100 times without looking at twice. And between the faces she didn't recognize were documents. Police reports with names redacted. Coroner's reports. Incident reports from precincts across the city spanning what looked, when she sorted by date, like the better part of 3 decades. She stopped on one. Then another. The pattern of it assembled itself in the part of her brain that was always working, always sorting, always building the shape of a thing from its components. Disappearances. Not random ones. Disappearances connected to each other by a thread she could see but not yet name, spread across the city across 30 years, each one officially unsolved, each one corresponding to a location she could now place on the map she was building inside her head, from the surveillance photographs and the shipping route codes and the financial ledgers that moved money in ways no legitimate business had any reason to move money. She clicked to the last subfolder. It contained a single image file. She opened it. The photograph was taken from across a street, a residential street. She could see the gutters, the particular width of the sidewalk, the style of the houses, the kind of street that existed in 100 suburbs ringing the city. She was in the photograph. She was 17 years old. She could tell that from the shape of her face and the jacket she had worn that year. A green military surplus jacket she had bought at a resale shop and worn until the elbows gave out. She was standing outside the small brick house she had grown up in. She was carrying a backpack. She was looking down at something in her hands, probably her phone, probably a text from someone at school, living the kind of ordinary Tuesday afternoon that left no memory, because nothing distinguished it from the Tuesdays before and after. She had never seen this photograph. The timestamp in the lower right corner of the image was from 12 years before she walked into a charity fundraiser and met Damien Valenti for what she had always believed was the first time. The air in the study was very cold and very still. Vivian did not move for a long moment. She sat in the blue light of the screen and she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not exactly, but the specific sensation of ground disappearing beneath a step she'd already taken, the recognition that what she was standing on was not what she had believed it to be. Her mind was already working, already pulling the threads, already beginning to construct the shape of something enormous and dark from the pieces she had just found. But the shape wasn't complete yet, and she was still sitting in the chair staring at herself at 17 years old when she became aware that she was not alone in the room. She didn't hear him come in. She never heard Damien move. Another thing she had catalogued and accepted as a quality of the man. The particular animal quietness of him, the way he occupied space without announcing it. But she felt the change in the room, the subtle shift of air and attention, and she knew before she turned that he was standing in the doorway behind her. She turned. He was wearing the shirt he'd had on at dinner, untucked now, standing in the doorway with one hand resting loosely against the frame and his eyes on her face, not on the screen. He had been awake. She could see that. The particular quality of alertness behind his eyes was not the softened thing of someone recently woken. He had been awake, and he had known the laptop was open, and he had come to find it exactly like this. He didn't ask what she had found. He didn't tell her to close the screen. He didn't do any of the things a man does when he has been caught in something and hasn't prepared for it. He just stood there and looked at her with that stillness she had loved and never fully understood. And after a silence that lasted long enough to have its own weight and texture, he said, "Now you know why I never wanted you to open that computer." Vivian looked at him. She looked at the man she had married, the man whose name she carried, the man who had held her through the nights when the insomnia got bad, and who had never once raised his voice at her, and who had been, by every measure she had ever thought to apply, the closest thing to a constant she had found in an adult life that had not lacked for difficulty. She looked at the photograph still open on the screen. Herself at 17. 12 years before they met. "How long?" she said. Her voice came out level. She had not known it would be level. Some professional part of her had held the reins without being asked. Damien didn't answer immediately. He looked at the screen for the first time, a brief, assessing look, the kind that wasn't reading the image, but reading what it told him about what she now knew. And then he looked back at her. "You should get some sleep," he said. "Damien, it's late." "Look at me," she said. "Look at me and tell me how long." Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt, or not only guilt. Something more complicated than that. Something she didn't have a name for yet because she had never seen it on him before. The expression of a man standing at the edge of something he had spent years keeping contained and feeling it begin to give way. "Come to bed," he said quietly. "I'll explain in the morning." "You'll explain now." She stood up from the desk. Her legs were steady. She was grateful for that. "I'm a lawyer, Damien. I just looked at 3 decades of financial transactions through structures that don't exist on paper. And I looked at surveillance photographs connected to a pattern of disappearances. And I looked at a photograph of myself at 17 years old sitting in a folder on your computer that you have never wanted me to go near." "So," she kept her eyes on his, "you'll explain now." The silence in the study had a different quality than the silences she was used to with him. The silences she was used to were the silences of a man who thought before he spoke, who chose his words with the care of someone who understood their weight. This silence was different. This one had the quality of a door being held shut by effort. "Everything I've done," Damien said finally, "I did to keep you safe." "From what?" He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, and in the cold blue light of the open laptop screen she watched his face settle into something that was not quite what she had believed it to be for 4 years, watched the surface of him shift almost imperceptibly towards something underneath that she had never been allowed to see. "From the truth about your father," he said. Vivian felt the floor do the thing it had done earlier, the disappearing beneath the step sensation, the ground that was not ground. She had grown up with a father who was a quiet, careful man, a financial consultant with a small office in Evanston, and a taste for single malt whiskey and crossword puzzles, a man who had died of a heart attack when she was 22, and who she had mourned with the particular grief of a daughter who had never known her parent well enough to know what she was losing. "My father," she said. "What about my father?" Damien reached into the pocket of his shirt. Slowly, he did everything slowly, with that deliberate quality that she understood now she had never fully read correctly. He took out a small drive. He held it out toward her across the desk. "It's all there," he said. "If you want to know. It's all there, and I won't stop you from looking." He paused. "But I need you to understand, Vivian. Once you look, you don't get to go back to not knowing. And what you find on that drive is going to change every story you've ever told yourself about your life." She stared at the drive in his outstretched hand. She thought about the photograph. Herself at 17. The timestamp that predated their meeting by 12 years. She thought about the financial structures, the pattern of disappearances, the size and scope of what she had seen in the 30 seconds before she understood she was being watched. She thought about the way he had walked into this room and looked at her with something in his eyes she had never seen before, and said, "Now you know why," instead of "I can explain," because those were not the same thing, not even close. And a woman who had spent 11 years untangling language for a living did not miss the difference. Vivian Cross reached across the desk and took the drive out of her husband's hand. She stood there with the drive in her hand and Damien standing 4 feet away from her, and the silence between them had the quality of a room that had just been broken into. Everything in the same position as before, but the air itself changed, the sense that something had passed through and left it different, and there was no way to restore what it had been. She closed her fingers around the drive. Damien watched her do it. He didn't move. His hands were at his sides and his face was doing what his face did. That surface of composure that she had read as steadiness for 4 years and was reading differently now, reading it as a kind of armor, something constructed and maintained by will and long practice. "I'm going to need you to leave this room," she said. "Vivian, I need you to leave this room right now." He looked at her for another moment. Then he pushed off the doorframe and walked away down the corridor, and she heard the soft close of the bedroom door at the far end of the apartment, and she sat back down in front of the laptop and plugged in the drive. It took her 4 hours to go through everything on it. By the time she was done, the city outside the windows had moved from bruised gray into the pale flat white of early morning, and her coffee had gone cold beside her, and she was sitting very still in Damien's desk chair with both hands flat on the desk surface, and her breathing was the deliberate, controlled kind. The kind she used in the worst depositions, the kind she used when the evidence was worse than what she had prepared herself for, and she needed to keep her face from doing what it wanted to do. She needed that now. Richard Cross had not been a financial consultant, or he had been. That part was technically accurate, the small office in Evanston, the modest client list, the tax returns that showed a respectable, if unremarkable, income over 20 years of professional practice. That part was real. But underneath it, in the same way that Damien's legitimate investment portfolio sat on top of something vastly larger and darker, Richard Cross had operated as the primary financial architect for the Valenti crime syndicate for the better part of 2 decades. He had laundered money, not small amounts, not the kind of petty cleaning that small-time operators ran through cash businesses, and explained as fluctuating revenue. He had moved hundreds of millions through structures he designed himself, legitimate-seeming investment vehicles that allowed the Valenti organization to surface clean capital across banking systems in 6 countries. He had been, by every measure she could read in the documents spread across the drive, brilliant at it. The kind of brilliant that left no obvious footprints, that built redundancies and backups and alternative explanations at every layer, that anticipated the questions investigators would ask before those investigators existed. And then, when she was 14 years old, he had stolen from them. Not skimming, not the kind of gradual erosion that organizations like the Valentis tolerated and monitored and eventually addressed with a conversation that ended certain careers. He had taken $38 million in a single coordinated movement, lifted it out of the structures he had built, and moved it through 3 intermediaries she didn't recognize into accounts that corresponded, cross-referenced against the documents she'd found in the laptop folder, to a rival syndicate operating out of Detroit. He had taken the money and he had handed evidence to people who could use it. The internal war it triggered had lasted 3 years. The documents didn't give her body counts. The documents were financial records, not after-action reports. But she could read the economic signature of a sustained violent conflict and the patterns of disruption to the syndicate's revenue flows across that period, and what it told her was that the war had been long and costly, and had taken things from the Valenti organization that money couldn't replace, including the people at the top of it. She found Damien's parents in a separate folder, cross-referenced by name. A shipping company executive who had also served as the organization's primary liaison to City Hall. His wife, who had managed the legitimate front businesses. Both of them dead inside a 6-month window during the peak of the internal war. Both deaths officially attributed to unrelated causes. She didn't need to read the medical examiner's reports to understand what the financial records were telling her about the actual sequence of events. Her father had done this. Her father, who she had buried at 22 with the grief of a daughter who hadn't known him well enough, had built the bomb and set the fuse and walked away clean while other people's families burned. And then he had died of a heart attack at 61 and taken everything he knew to a grave in a well-maintained cemetery in Wilmette. And she had cried at that grave, and Damien Valenti had been watching her cry at it. She had found the photograph in the last folder on the drive. From a distance of about 80 feet, standing beside a dark car, watching the daughter of the man who had destroyed his family lower that man into the ground. She sat with all of this for a long time. Then she stood up, closed the laptop, put the drive in the inside pocket of her robe, and walked down the corridor to the bedroom. Damien was awake. She had known he would be. He was sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark, elbows on his knees, and he didn't turn when she came in, just sat there with that stillness that she understood differently now than she had understood it 3 hours ago. "My father," she said from the doorway. "Your parents." He didn't answer. "That's what this is." He turned then, slowly, and looked at her across the dark room. "How long did you plan it?" she said. "Before we met." "How long had you been—" 7 years. The word sat in the room. 7 years, she said. "I found you when you were 17. I had people watch your father for years before that, trying to locate the money, trying to understand the full structure of what he'd built. And when I found you, He stopped. Started again. "I thought you were part of it. Children of men like your father sometimes know more than they appear to. I knew nothing. I know that now. But you kept watching me." "Yes." She walked into the room and sat in the chair by the window, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the city below went on doing what the city did, indifferent and continuous. "The donations," she said. "My college." "Yes." "The anonymous scholarship." "Yes." She had always believed it was a foundation grant. Her academic record had been strong enough to qualify. The paperwork had been legitimate. She had never had any reason to pull at that thread. She was pulling at it now and watching everything it connected to lift up out of the ground. 3 years of law school, she said. A full ride. You earned it. I just made sure the money was there. That's not... She stopped, pushed the air out through her nose. That's not a justification, Damien. That's not something you get to say like it closes the ledger. I'm not trying to close anything. His voice was quiet and even in the way it was always quiet and even, and she was having difficulty right now not hearing that quality as something calculated rather than natural. I'm trying to tell you what happened. Then tell me about the men who disappeared before they could hurt me. She watched his face. The 2 clients, Marcus Hurd, the deputy state's attorney in 2019 who dropped his harassment complaint and relocated to Phoenix 6 weeks later. Damien was still. That file was on the drive, she said. I found it. Those situations were complicated. I'm a lawyer who puts complicated situations in front of juries for a living. Try me. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the particular quality of a man who has decided to let something go that he has held for a long time, he said, Hurd was going to go further than harassment. I had information that confirmed it. I moved him out of the situation before it escalated. You moved him. She repeated the words carefully. What does that mean? It means he's alive and he stopped. And the deputy state's attorney. He had a different kind of leverage. He knew your father. Not what your father was, but who he had been to certain people in city government. He was going to use that to damage your career. I made sure he understood that was not a direction he wanted to go. Vivian stood up from the chair. She needed to be standing. She needed her feet on the floor and the weight of herself grounded against something solid, because the alternative was a quality of dislocation she recognized as dangerous. The feeling of the floor going out, the sense of tumbling through a sequence of revelations that had no bottom. You have been managing my life, she said. I have been protecting you from threats that existed because of the organization you run. Some of them, yes. So the danger and the protection were both coming from the same source. Not always, but yes, sometimes. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, hard. It was a physical thing she did when she needed to stay located in her body. Her therapist had taught her that years ago, during a period of her life that had cost her more than she generally let herself think about. She used it now. "I need to know something," she said, "and I need the true answer." He waited. "Did you marry me because of what my father did to your family?" The silence that followed had a different texture than the ones before. This one was not the silence of a man choosing his words carefully. This one was the silence of a man for whom the question had reached something real, something that sat underneath all the layers of planning and control and composed steadiness, something that moved. "In the beginning," he said, "what I intended, yes. In the beginning, what I had planned was not what happened." "That's not an answer." "I know." He stood up from the bed. He was a tall man and the room was dark, and in the low light coming through the window, he looked the way he had always looked to her, and also entirely different. Like a photograph developing backward, the familiar image dissolving into something she hadn't seen before. "When I first planned how this would go, I wanted to watch you understand what your father had done. I wanted you to carry that. I thought you deserved to carry it. And then I spent 3 years watching you work, watching how you operated, watching what you did with your career and why you did it." He paused. "You went after the same kinds of men your father worked for. You didn't know that. You couldn't have known. But you spent 11 years building cases against people exactly like him. And He stopped. The composure was not absent, but it was working harder than she had ever seen it work. "I fell in love with who you were, not with what I had planned for you." Vivian looked at him across the dark room. She had cross-examined witnesses for 11 years. She had sat in rooms with men who had done terrible things, and she had asked them questions, and she had learned over those years to read the difference between the particular quality of a lie and the particular quality of the truth, which were not always as distinct as people imagined, but were never identical. There was a physical signature to each. The truth had a quality of weight and discomfort. It cost something to say. It landed differently than the smooth transit of a practiced lie. What she was looking at right now had weight. That did not resolve anything. It didn't begin to resolve the size of what she had found in that drive. The architecture of surveillance and intervention and managed protection and planned exposure that her marriage was apparently built on. But it landed with weight, and she couldn't pretend otherwise. She took the drive out of her pocket. She set it on the dresser. "I'm going to stay in the guest suite tonight," she said. "Tomorrow I'm going to my office. I'm going to think about what I do with what I know. And you're not going to follow me, and you're not going to have anyone follow me, and you are not going to manage this situation." She looked at him steadily. "If you manage this situation, Damien, I will assume the worst and act accordingly. Do you understand what I mean by that?" He understood. She could see that he understood. "Yes," he said. She walked out of the bedroom. The next 72 hours were the most controlled 72 hours of Vivian's professional life, which was a distinction that required a moment to appreciate given the competition. She went to the office. She told her assistant she was working a research project that required privacy and held her calls. She used the firm's legal research access to pull corporate registration records, SEC filings, property records, and federal contractor disclosures, and she cross-referenced them against the financial structures she had photographed off the laptop screen. She had photographed everything, quickly, with her phone, before she even plugged in the drive, because she was a lawyer and lawyers documented before they acted, and some instinct deeper than procedure had told her to document fast. What she built in those 72 hours was a map, not a metaphorical one, an actual document, organized in the way she organized complex conspiracy cases, the visual architecture of connection and flow and hierarchy that she used to show juries how systems worked. At the center of it was an entity she came to think of simply as the network, because it had no consistent formal name and operated through so many subsidiary structures that naming it for any one of them was like naming the ocean for a particular harbor. The network was not a criminal organization in the conventional sense, not the kind of structure she had prosecuted, the kind with soldiers and captains and a visible chain of command that left footprints and wiretap evidence and confidential informant testimony. It was older than that and more dispersed, built over decades into the fabric of legitimate Chicago commerce in a way that was almost architectural. The investment vehicles were real investment vehicles. The charitable foundations made real charitable contributions. The board members were real board members, prominent ones, in many cases people she had met at the kind of fundraising events that Damien attended, and that she had accompanied him to, and that she now understood she had been walking through like a woman touring the exterior of a building she didn't know she lived inside. The Valenti name ran through all of it, not brazenly, not the way names ran through the organizations she had prosecuted, etched into incorporation papers and deed transfers and phone records, more like a signature visible only under certain light, a thread woven through the fabric at intervals that only made sense if you already knew how to look. But it was there. And the deeper she went, the more she began to understand something that the documents on the drive had shown her only partially. Damien had not built this structure. He had inherited it. The network predated him by decades. It had been built by the generation before him, the generation that her father had served and then betrayed. And what Damien had done in the years since his parents' deaths was not expand it, but contain it. The distinction mattered legally. It also mattered in a way she was not entirely willing to examine yet. On the third day, she found the federal file. She found it because she was good at her job and because she knew how to read the negative space in public court documents. What had been filed and then sealed, what had been opened and then closed without resolution, what patterns in federal court schedules suggested ongoing investigations that had not surfaced publicly. There was an investigation. It had been running for 2 years. It sat inside a national security filing framework that her clearance didn't reach, which meant it was larger than a standard organized crime case, which meant that someone at the federal level understood something about the network's reach that the standard prosecutorial structures weren't equipped to handle. She sat with that for a long time. Then she drove home. Damien was in the kitchen. He was making coffee. The particular single-origin process he performed every morning, unhurried, as though the world arranged itself to provide him with the time his rituals required. He looked up when she came in, and he didn't speak, just watched her set her bag on the counter and lean against it, with her arms crossed, and waited. "There's a federal investigation," she said. He was still. 2 years old, national security seal, which means someone at the agency level thinks the network has ties that go beyond conventional organized crime. She watched him. "How far does it go, Damien?" He set down the coffee implement he was holding. He turned fully toward her. "Further than you want to know." "Tell me anyway." "Vivian, tell me. Because right now I'm a woman who is sitting on evidence that could support a federal prosecution, and I need to make decisions about what I do with that evidence, and I cannot make those decisions from partial information." Something shifted in him, a quality she hadn't seen in 4 years of watching him closely. Something that looked, for just a moment, like a man who was tired. Not physically tired. The other kind. The kind that accumulated over decades and lived in the bones. "The network has relationships with federal contractors," he said. "Defense contractors. Infrastructure. Certain security operations that run adjacent to government activity." He paused. "Some of those relationships were established by the previous generation. Some of them I inherited with everything else. And some of them—" He stopped, looked at her with that quality of cost she was beginning to recognize as the face he wore when he was telling the truth. "Some of them I have been trying, for the past 4 years, to systematically dismantle without triggering the kind of collapse that would pull down people who don't deserve to go down with it." "You've been trying to shut it down." "From the inside. Quietly. Over time." She looked at him. "And the federal investigation? Knows I exist. Does not know what I've been doing." He met her eyes. "Which is a problem, because if they move before I've finished, they'll take down the structure without distinguishing between what it is and what I've been building to replace it. And the people who built the original network, the ones who are still alive, the ones who were around when your father was working for them, they'll disappear into the parts the government doesn't know about yet, and they'll rebuild." Vivian uncrossed her arms. She set both hands flat on the counter. She needed the physical anchor again. "You need the evidence I found," she said slowly. "The evidence on the drive and on the laptop. You need the complete financial picture to be in the right hands before the federal investigation surfaces. Otherwise, the wrong people walk." Damien looked at her without expression. Then he said very quietly, "I need a lawyer." She laughed. It came out wrong, too sharp, too short, catching in her chest before it finished. She pressed her hand against her sternum. "You're insane," she said. "Possibly. You surveilled me for 7 years, built a criminal empire that contributed to my father's decisions, managed my professional life without my knowledge, and now you want me to—" "I want you to make your own choice," he said. "With everything you know, I'm not managing this. I told you I wouldn't, and I'm not." He looked at her steadily across the kitchen. "You found the evidence. You built the map. You understand the structure better than anyone alive who isn't me. What you do with that is yours." The coffee maker finished its cycle. Neither of them moved to pour it. Vivian looked at the man she had married and understood, with the cold, prosecutorial clarity that had built her career, that she was standing at the edge of something that did not offer a return path. Whatever choice she made in the next 24 hours would become the decision that the rest of her life organized itself around. She was still standing there, still working through the permutations, when her phone vibrated on the counter. She looked down at it. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize, and it said 4 words. "He didn't tell you everything." She looked up at Damien. His eyes were already on her phone, and for the first time since she had walked into his study 3 days ago, the composure on his face was not entirely in place. There was something underneath it, something that looked almost like fear, and the sight of it on him was more frightening than anything she had found on the drive. She turned the phone so he could see the screen. He read it. The muscle along his jaw moved, one small involuntary contraction, the kind of tell a man couldn't train out of himself no matter how long he spent learning to keep still. "Who sent this?" she said. "I don't know." "Damien, I genuinely do not know." He reached for the phone and she pulled it back before his fingers reached it. A reflex, fast, and they both registered what it meant. She didn't trust him with it. He let his hand drop. "There are people who know you've been in my files. People who've been watching this apartment for reasons that have nothing to do with protecting you. The rival families. Some of them. And others. People connected to the federal investigation who run assets I haven't fully identified yet." Vivian looked back at the message. 4 words and an unknown number, and the particular cold quality of a warning delivered with precision, timed for exactly this moment, when she was already off balance enough that 4 words could knock her the rest of the way over. She had spent 11 years in courtrooms, and she knew what it looked like when someone wanted you afraid enough to move in a specific direction. She put the phone in her pocket. "You said there were things you were still dismantling," she said. "Things from the previous generation. The men who were there when my father was working for them and survived what he triggered." "Yes, they know about me." Damien looked at her. The fear she had seen move through his composure was gone now, replaced by something harder and more familiar, the quality of a man who had spent decades making calculations in conditions that didn't allow for hesitation. "They've always known about you," he said. "They've let you exist because I made certain terms very clear, very early." He paused. "Those terms hold as long as the balance holds. But if someone is sending you messages from an unknown number, it means someone has decided the balance is about to shift. Because of what I found. Because of what you found, and what you might do with it." The kitchen felt very small. Vivian looked at the window, at the city beyond it, at the ordinary Sunday morning surface of a world that had nothing to do with what was happening in this room. "If I walk out of this apartment right now and go to the federal building," she said, "how long before those terms stop holding?" Damien didn't answer. He didn't need to. She already knew. She pulled the drive from her pocket and set it on the counter between them, and the small sound it made against the granite was the sound of a door closing on everything that had come before it. "Then we do this your way," she said, "but we do it my way too. Every step. No managing, no decisions I don't make myself." She looked at him. "And you tell me everything. Not what you think I need to know. Everything." Damien looked at her for a long moment. "Everything," he said quietly, "is going to take a while." "Then you'd better start now." He talked until 3 in the morning. Not continuously. Damien Valenti was not a man who talked continuously about anything. He talked in the way he did everything else, with deliberate economy, choosing what he released and in what order, and Vivian sat across from him at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and took notes. The way she took notes in depositions, not because she needed the paper, but because the act of writing kept her hands occupied and her mind from running too far ahead of what he was saying. He told her about the network's actual structure, not the simplified version she had reconstructed from the files, but the full architecture, the relationships between the legitimate surface and the operational layer beneath it, the way decisions moved through the hierarchy, and who held what kind of leverage over whom. He told her about the federal contractors and the nature of the services the network provided to entities that operated in the gray space between government and private sector: security operations, intelligence support, logistics for activities that required deniability. He told her about the men from the previous generation who were still alive and still active, who they were and what they controlled, and why dismantling their positions required the kind of patience that had consumed the last 4 years of his life. He told her about her father in more detail than the drive had given her. Richard Cross had not simply stolen money and handed evidence to a rival organization. He had done something more structurally damaging than that. He had built a second set of books, a shadow record of every transaction he had facilitated over 20 years, and he had used that record as insurance. Not insurance against the Valentis specifically, insurance against everything. A document of mutual destruction that he had distributed in fragments to multiple parties, structured so that no single holder had the complete picture, so that its power as a deterrent required all the pieces to remain separated. He thought it would keep him safe, Damien said. It didn't. Not from the people he'd already given the pieces to. The Detroit organization didn't need the complete record. They just needed enough to move against the Valentis directly. He looked at his coffee, which had also gone cold. Your father underestimated how willing some people are to destroy themselves along with their enemies. Where are the fragments now? Damien was quiet for a moment. That's the part I haven't been able to fully resolve, he said. I have 3 of the 5 fragments. I've spent 4 years locating and acquiring them. The other 2 are held by parties I have not been able to reach without triggering exactly the kind of conflict I've been trying to avoid. Who holds them? He told her. 2 names. She wrote them down and looked at what she'd written and understood immediately why he hadn't been able to reach them through conventional means. One was a sitting federal circuit judge. The other was the director of a private intelligence firm with contracts across 4 federal agencies. Both were untouchable in the conventional sense. Both were, by the nature of what they held, invested in the current equilibrium, the balance that kept them safe as long as no one moved first. If those 2 fragments surface, she said slowly, combined with what you already have and what I pulled from your files, combined with your evidentiary expertise and the right filing strategy, yes, it becomes a complete prosecution package. One that doesn't require a confidential informant or a cooperating witness. One that the federal investigation already running would have to absorb and act on because the evidentiary weight would be impossible to suppress. She looked at him. You've been waiting for a lawyer, she said, not just any lawyer, a lawyer who already has prosecutorial credibility in this jurisdiction and who can't be easily discredited. She set down her pen. You've been waiting for me. He met her eyes. I've been hoping, he said carefully, that if you ever found out all of it the way you found it, that the person you'd become would be capable of seeing past what I did to see what needs to happen. That's a long game. It's the only game I knew how to play. She picked up the pen again. She tapped it once against the legal pad. The anonymous text, she said. Someone knows I've been in your files. Someone who isn't you and isn't on your side. Yes. Which means we don't have 4 years, we probably don't have 4 weeks. No, he said. We probably don't. She looked at what she had written, the names, the structure, the fragments, the federal investigation, the contractors, the judge, the intelligence director. A map of a problem that was larger and more complex than anything she had taken to trial in 11 years of practice. Go to sleep, she said. I need to think. He left the kitchen without argument, and she sat there until 5 in the morning with the legal pad and the cold coffee and the city outside doing its indifferent continuous thing. And she built the strategy the way she always built strategies, from the outside in, identifying the constraints first, then the available moves within those constraints, then the sequence that gave the best outcomes against the most probable opposition responses. By the time the light changed, she had the shape of it. It was not a comfortable shape. It required her to do things she had never done in her professional life, to operate in spaces her bar license was not designed to navigate, to trust a man she had married under false pretenses with the kind of operational coordination that left no room for the kind of concealed maneuvering he had spent years performing. But it was the shape that worked. She spent the following week moving carefully. She told the partners at Harwick she was taking personal leave. Family health matter, she said, which was technically true in a way she didn't elaborate on. She pulled her most sensitive active cases and handed them to the two associates she trusted most, briefing them with the kind of thoroughness that suggested she might be gone longer than a week. She moved certain files from her office to a secure location that was not the apartment and not the firm. A storage facility registered under a holding company she had established 3 years earlier for a client matter and never dissolved. A small administrative oversight that was now, in retrospect, extraordinarily convenient. She met twice with a contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office, not to disclose anything, not yet, but to take the temperature of the federal investigation through the kind of oblique professional conversation that lawyers and prosecutors conducted all the time, the kind that revealed more in what was not said than in what was. What she learned confirmed Damien's assessment. The investigation was real, was active, and was approximately 6 to 8 weeks from a grand jury filing that would move against the network's surface structures without the evidentiary depth to reach the actual source. 6 to 8 weeks. It was not enough time to do this cleanly. On the 8th day, she drove to an address Damien had given her, a building in the West Loop that registered publicly as a commercial property management office and served, as she now understood such things, a more layered purpose. She went alone. Damien had offered to come, and she had said no because she needed to establish her own relationship to this part of his world rather than enter it as an extension of him, and he had understood that and not argued. The man she was meeting was named Carver. No first name offered, none requested. He was in his late 50s, compact and deliberately unremarkable in the way of people whose professional survival had depended on being forgettable, and he had served as Damien's primary operational coordinator for the past 12 years. He sat across from her in a room with no windows and a table that had seen better decades, and he looked at her with the particular assessing quality of someone deciding how much to trust a variable he hadn't chosen. She looked back at him the same way. "He says you're the one running the legal strategy," Carver said. "I am. You understand what that means, in practical terms, what you're going to be touching. I understand that I'm going to be operating in areas where my bar license is the least of my concerns," she said. "Yes, I understand that." Carver looked at her for another moment. Then he slid a manila folder across the table. She opened it. Inside were surveillance photographs. New ones, not from Damien's files. These showed 2 locations, a parking structure she didn't recognize on the north side, and a building in River North that she did recognize because she had attended a fundraiser there 18 months ago, a charitable event that Damien had organized, and that she had assumed was what it appeared to be. "These were taken in the last 72 hours, Carver said. "The north side location is a coordination point for the Kessler Group, one of the families that's been watching the Valenti organization since the fragmentation wars. The River North location..." He paused. "That one's more complicated." She studied the River North photographs, the building, the angles, the partial faces of the people entering and exiting. She stopped on one image, looked at it more carefully, looked at the partial profile of a man in a dark coat entering through the building's side entrance at what the timestamp indicated was 11:40 on a Tuesday evening. She knew that coat. She had bought it. She had stood in a store on Michigan Avenue and held it out and said this one, and watched the man she was buying it for put it on and tell her it was too expensive. She looked up at Carver. "That's Marcus Webb," she said. Her voice came out level, the controlled kind. "That's Damien's attorney, his personal attorney." Carver's face told her nothing. "The River North building," she said carefully, "is a coordination point for who?" "The Kessler Group also uses it," Carver said, "but that's not primarily what it is." He tapped the photograph. "That building is the primary contact point for whoever has been running intelligence support for the federal investigation. The private side, the firm with the federal contracts. She looked back at the photograph. Marcus Webb, Damien's personal attorney of 11 years, the man who had structured every legitimate aspect of the Valenti holdings, the man who held power of attorney for 3 of Damien's primary investment vehicles, the man who had been present. She was reconstructing this rapidly, at every major strategic meeting she had ever partially witnessed in 4 years of marriage. He's the source, she said, the anonymous text. The people who know I've been in the files, it's Webb. Carver didn't confirm or deny it. He didn't need to. She closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. How long? She said. We believe approximately 18 months, possibly longer. 18 months. She ran the timeline backward in her head. 18 months ago, she had taken a case, a significant one, a federal contractor procurement fraud matter that had put her in contact with exactly the kind of government-adjacent figures Damien had described as connected to the network's outer layer. She had won that case. It had been considered a significant professional achievement. She had been profiled in 2 legal publications as a result. She thought about who had referred that case to her. Marcus Webb had referred that case to her. He's been using me, she said, to get access to establish a connection between you and the network's legitimate structures that could be used to... Carver stopped. Something in his face shifted, a quality of reluctance, as though the next sentence was one he had hoped not to have to say. Used to compromise you. If the prosecution strategy you and Damien are developing moves forward, Webb can surface a chain of connections between your professional activities and the network that would discredit you as a witness or legal architect before you could file. The room was very quiet. Vivian sat with this. She sat with the specific quality of it. Not just the betrayal, not just the operational damage, but the structural elegance of it, the way it had been built over 18 months to create exactly this point of maximum leverage. A woman who had married into the network, who had been fed a prosecution strategy by the man she'd married, whose own professional history could now be reframed as complicity rather than independence. Does Damien know? She said. He knows now. I told him this morning. And Webb. Webb doesn't know we know. Not yet. She stood up from the table. She needed to move. She walked to the far wall and stood there for a moment with her back to Carver and her hands loose at her sides. And she breathed, deliberately, carefully, the way she breathed in the worst depositions, the way she breathed when the evidence turned against her mid-trial, and she needed to find the next move before the other side understood what had happened. Webb had the means to destroy her credibility before she could act. The federal investigation had a 6 to 8 week timeline before it moved on its own, incompletely, and let the people at the actual source walk. And somewhere in the city, there were 2 fragments of her father's insurance document, held by a federal judge, and an intelligence director who had now, almost certainly through Webb's coordination, been made aware that someone was trying to assemble the complete picture. She turned back to Carver. Where is Damien right now? She said. En route here. Call him. Tell him not to come. Tell him to go to the contingency location and wait. She picked up her bag. And tell him I need the location of the abandoned cathedral. Carver's expression shifted. Something moved behind the professional blankness. Something that might have been surprise or might have been a different kind of assessment entirely. That location is not known to people outside the organization's inner... I know what it is, she said. Damien described it to me. Tell him I need it, and tell him I'm going alone first. That's not... Tell him. She looked at Carver steadily. I'm the lawyer on this. That means I need to walk the ground before we make our next move, without anyone managing what I see or how I see it. He'll understand. Carver looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for his phone. She drove north out of the West Loop through traffic that moved with the sluggish indifference of a Tuesday afternoon, and she kept her hands at 10 and 2 and her eyes on the road, and she ran the problem the way she always ran problems, stripping it to its essential structure, identifying what was actually true versus what had been presented as true, looking for the move that existed in the gap between what the opposition expected and what was actually available. Webb expected her to react to the exposure of his position by retreating, by pulling back from the prosecution strategy, by reconsidering her involvement. by doing what a rational person with a professional reputation to protect would do when confronted with evidence that her credibility had been systematically undermined. He had built the trap to produce exactly that response. She had spent 11 years in courtrooms, and she knew what you did when the trap was already closed around you. You stopped trying to get out of it. You figured out how to make the trap work for you instead. She parked 3 blocks from the address Carver had given her and walked the rest of the way through an industrial stretch of the near north that had been half converted to loft developments and left the rest to slowly finish its long argument with entropy. The building that appeared at the end of the block was a former warehouse that had been briefly, decades ago, a performance space, and before that, something she couldn't read from the exterior. Large, brick, with a roofline that suggested its original interior height had been cathedral-like in the secular sense, vaulted and severe. The door at the side entrance was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside and stopped. The interior was vast and cold and full of the particular quality of silence that large, empty spaces produced. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of space, the sound of cubic footage, and stone and air that had been still for a long time. The floor was concrete. The ceiling rose 40 feet above her to exposed steel trusses. Along the far wall, where windows had once been, someone had covered them with panels that allowed no light in from outside. And the only illumination came from a series of industrial work lights clamped to the trusses at intervals, casting hard-edged pools of white across the floor below. In the center of the floor, beneath the largest of those pools of light, Damien was already there. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets and his back to the door, looking up at the trusses, and he turned when he heard her footsteps, and she saw in his face that Carver had told him everything, the full calculation of what Webb had done and what it meant and what it had cost her. She walked to the center of the room and stopped 6 feet from him. "You should have told me about Webb," she said. "I didn't know about Webb. Not until this morning." "You should have considered Webb. Someone that close with that much access." "I know." 11 years, Damien. 11 years he had power of attorney on 3 vehicles. He could have been feeding the federal investigation since before you started the dismantling process. Everything you've been building toward, every fragment you've acquired, every structural move you've made in 4 years, he may have a record of all of it. "I know." The word was flat and final and carried the weight of a man who had been sitting with that reality since morning and had moved through the first several stages of it already. "Then tell me what you know that I don't, right now. Everything Webb had access to," he told her. She stood in the cold light of the empty building and listened without interrupting and built the damage assessment in real time, and it was worse than she had initially calculated. Not catastrophically worse, but worse in the specific ways that mattered most, which was that Webb's access to the acquisition records for 2 of the 3 fragments Damien had secured meant that the parties holding the remaining 2 fragments had almost certainly been warned that someone was coming for them, which meant the window she had calculated at 6 to 8 weeks was probably already closed. She was still processing this when she heard the sound. It came from above, a concussive pressure more than a noise, felt in the chest before it registered in the ears, and then the building's north wall detonated inward in a cascade of brick and steel and displaced air that knocked her off her feet and put the floor against her cheek, and put the sound of the world out like a light. And when the sound came back, it came back as the overlapping register of falling debris and a secondary explosion somewhere deeper in the building and voices she didn't recognize shouting to each other in a language she couldn't identify above the ringing that had replaced all her other hearing. She pushed herself up on her hands. The dust was extraordinary. A physical thing, white and total, reducing visibility to 3 feet in any direction. She could taste concrete. She was bleeding somewhere on her face. She could feel the warmth of it without locating the source. "Damien," her voice came out wrong, too thin, scraped raw by the dust. A hand closed around her arm from the direction she hadn't expected and pulled her upright, and it was him. She knew his hands. 4 years of knowing had put that into her nervous system at a level below thought. And he had blood on his face too, a cut along his hairline that had sheeted one side of his face red, and his eyes, when they found hers in the dust-thick dark, were not the composed, steady eyes she had known for 4 years. They were the eyes of a man who had just watched something he had spent years preventing arrive ahead of schedule. "We have to move," he said. "Now." "Who?" Now, Vivian. He pulled her toward the south end of the building, away from the destroyed north wall, and behind them the sounds continued. More voices, the systematic sound of people moving through a space they had planned to move through, the particular purposeful quality of a coordinated entry that had not finished what it had come to do. She ran. Not the way she ran on the lakefront path on Sunday mornings, measured, paced, the comfortable rhythm of a woman maintaining a habit. This was the other kind, the kind that bypassed everything except the animal instruction to move, her heels hitting concrete in the dark while Damien's hand stayed locked around her wrist, and the sounds behind them grew more organized and more deliberate and closer. He knew the building. That was the only reason they were still moving in a direction that made sense. He navigated the dark and the dust without hesitation, pulling her through a doorway she hadn't seen, down a corridor that smelled of old water and rusted metal, toward a door at the far end that he hit with his shoulder without slowing, and it gave outward into an alley that ran between the building and a loading dock structure to the south. Cold air. She pulled it in. The ringing in her ears was beginning to stratify into separate sounds again. The building behind them, the city around them, her own breathing, his. He didn't stop at the alley. He turned south and moved fast along the loading dock wall, and she stayed with him and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say yet, and she understood that this particular silence had its own logic. They made it to her car. She drove. He didn't suggest otherwise. 3 blocks of silence. 4. She checked the mirrors with the systematic frequency of someone who had learned the behavior from a document rather than from instinct and was applying it very carefully. Webb didn't just warn them, she said. No. He gave them the location, tonight, which means he knew we were meeting here, which means my phones are compromised, have been for some time. She absorbed this, kept driving, took a left she hadn't planned to take, then another, putting distance and direction changes between them and the building. The federal investigation moves in 6 weeks, she said. Webb has our acquisition records for the fragments. The parties holding the last 2 have been warned. She stopped at a light. Tell me one thing that is still in our favor. Damien looked at her. In the passing light of the city, his face was blood and concrete dust, and the particular expression of a man arriving at a decision he had been postponing for a long time. You, he said. You're the one thing they didn't plan for correctly. They built every contingency around who I am, what I'm capable of. He looked at the road ahead. They have no model for you. The light changed. Vivian pressed the accelerator and felt something settle in her chest. Not calm exactly, but the cold functional thing that lived underneath panic when a person had enough training to reach it. They had underestimated her. She intended to make that the most expensive mistake anyone in this city had ever made. They drove for 40 minutes without a destination, which was itself a destination. Movement as a form of security, the city as cover, the anonymous flow of traffic as the only kind of protection available to 2 people who had just had their primary operational location destroyed and their communication infrastructure compromised, and their timeline collapsed from weeks into something that didn't have a comfortable name yet. Vivian drove. Damien sat in the passenger seat with a folded piece of cloth pressed against the cut on his hairline and his eyes on the side mirror, watching what came behind them with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who had spent decades watching what came behind him and had learned to read traffic patterns the way she read financial structures, for the anomalies, for the things that didn't fit the organic flow, for the car that changed lanes when she changed lanes and slowed when she slowed. Nothing followed them. That was either good, or it meant the people who had detonated the north wall of the warehouse already knew where they would end up and saw no reason to expend the effort of pursuit. The storage facility, she said. Not safe. Webb knew about your professional history. If he had access to my records, he may have traced the holding company. He didn't. She said it with a certainty that was not entirely warranted, but was the kind of certainty that the situation required. I established that company on a client matter with no connection to you or the network. The paperwork trail goes through a paralegal who left the firm 2 years ago and is currently in Portland. Webb would need to work backward through 3 layers of corporate registration in 2 states to find it, and he'd need to know it existed first. Damien considered this. How long to access what's there? 20 minutes inside. We have 20 minutes. She took the next left. The storage facility was in Pilsen, 3 stories of climate-controlled units in a building that had been a light manufacturing plant until the economics of light manufacturing in Chicago became what they became. She had the access code in memory. She committed access codes to memory the way she committed case citations, cleanly and permanently. And she moved through the entrance with her head down and her collar up, and Damien 2 steps behind her with the cloth still pressed to his head and blood dried in a dark stripe along his jaw. The unit was on the 2nd floor. Inside, the files she had transferred from Harwick, her personal backup drives, $20,000 in cash she had maintained as operational reserve since a case 3 years ago, had taught her the value of liquidity that didn't run through traceable accounts, 2 prepaid phones still in their packaging, and a contact list she had written by hand on a yellow legal pad and updated quarterly. Every prosecutor, federal agent, legal contact, and institutional relationship she had built over 11 years, organized not by name, but by the nature of what they could provide and what they would need in return. She pulled the legal pad first, then the phones, then the cash. Damien stood at the door of the unit with his back to her, watching the corridor, and she worked fast, pulling what she needed with the efficiency of someone who had known this moment was theoretically possible and had prepared for it without fully believing in the preparation until now. "Webb's play," she said while she worked. "Walk me through it from his perspective. What does he do next?" "He's already done it. He's given our position to the Kessler Group and whoever is running the federal intelligence contractor side. He surfaced the chain of connection between your professional history and the network. He has the acquisition records for 2 of the 3 fragments." Damien paused. "Next move is to let those pieces work. Let the Kessler Group keep us moving. Let the federal investigation absorb the compromised intelligence and build its filing around a version of the network that doesn't reach the actual source. And let your credibility degrade in the background until you're not a viable legal architect for anything." Passive strategy. Webb is a lawyer. Lawyers prefer passive strategies. "I know." She closed the storage unit. "So do I. Until they stop working." She handed him one of the prepaid phones and put the other in her coat pocket, and they walked back out to the car, and she sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine, looking at the legal pad on her knee. One name stood out. Not the most senior contact she had, not the one with the most institutional power, but the one she had assessed over years of professional interaction, who was honest in the way that a small number of people in positions of authority were honest, not ideologically, not performatively, but constitutionally. Honest the way a well-made tool was honest. It did what it was built to do, and it didn't pretend otherwise. Assistant U.S. Attorney Claire Maddox. Organized crime and racketeering. She had gone up against Maddox twice in 11 years. Lost once, won once. Maddox had called her the morning after the 2nd verdict and said, without apparent rancor, that it had been the best cross-examination she had witnessed in a decade. They had met for coffee 3 times since. They were not friends. They were something more professionally durable than friends. 2 people who understood exactly what the other was and respected it without sentiment. Vivian picked up the prepaid phone. Maddox answered on the 2nd ring, which meant she was awake and working at 11:40 on a Tuesday, which was consistent with everything Vivian knew about her. "It's Cross," Vivian said. "Don't say my name, don't use yours. I'm on a clean phone and I need 20 minutes of your time tonight." A pause. Short. Maddox was assessing. Vivian could feel the quality of the silence across the line, the rapid professional calculation of a woman deciding how to respond to something unexpected. "Where?" Maddox said. She named a location, a bar in Wicker Park that Maddox had mentioned once in passing as a place she went after difficult verdicts, not a known quantity to anyone who hadn't been paying attention to a throwaway comment 18 months ago, and Webb had not been in that conversation. 1 hour, Maddox said, and hung up. Damien looked at her. "You can't come," she said. "I know. Carver's contingency location. Stay off all communications except the prepaid. I'll contact you in 2 hours." She started the engine. "If I'm not in contact in 3, assume the meeting was compromised and execute whatever you have for that scenario." "I have something for that scenario." "I know you do." She pulled out of the parking structure. I'm counting on the fact that you have something for every scenario. She dropped him 4 blocks from the contingency location and drove to Wicker Park alone. The bar was the kind of place that understood its clientele: low light, high noise floor, the particular democratic anonymity of a room where everyone was absorbed in their own conversation and no one was interested in anyone else's. She found a booth in the back and ordered something she didn't intend to drink and sat with her coat on and her hands around the glass and waited. Maddox arrived 7 minutes early, which was also consistent with everything Vivian knew about her. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s with close-cut gray hair and the particular quality of physical stillness that Vivian associated with former athletes. She had run track at Northwestern. Vivian had read that somewhere, and it showed in the economy of how she moved, nothing wasted, everything purposeful. She slid into the booth across from Vivian, looked at the untouched drink, looked at the cut on Vivian's face that the low light wasn't quite concealing, and said nothing for a moment. "You look like you've had a night," Maddox said. "I need to talk to you about the investigation you're running adjacent to a national security seal, the one that's been building for 2 years and is approximately 6 weeks from a grand jury filing." Maddox's face did not change. "I'm not going to confirm or deny Claire." She used the first name deliberately. "I'm not here as opposing counsel. I'm not here in any professional capacity that involves me being on the other side of a table from you. I'm here because the filing you're building is going to miss the source by 3 levels of organizational structure, and by the time you understand that, the people who actually built what you're prosecuting will have dissolved into the parts of the network your investigation doesn't know exist, and they'll rebuild within 5 years, and we'll be having a different version of this conversation in a decade." Maddox was still. "That's a very specific critique," she said. "For someone who doesn't know the details of an investigation I haven't confirmed exists. I know the details because I have the complete financial architecture of the network going back 30 years. I have 3 of the 5 fragments of a documentary record that constitutes the single most comprehensive evidentiary package this investigation has access to. And I have the identity of the individual who has been running intelligence support for the contractor side of your investigation and simultaneously feeding operational intelligence to the network's primary rival organization." She held Maddox's eyes. "His name is Marcus Webb. He's been in this position for at least 18 months. Everything your investigation has received through the contractor channel in that period is compromised." The noise of the bar went on around them. Someone laughed loudly at a table across the room, the specific isolated quality of their booth held. Maddox looked at her for a very long time. "If what you're saying is accurate," she said finally, carefully, "then you understand what you're sitting on and what it would cost you to bring it to me." "Yes. Your connection to the network's principal figure would be examined." "I know. Your professional history for the past 4 years would be subject to full disclosure review." "I know that too." "You could be disbarred, depending on what the review surfaces." "I know what the review will surface," Vivian said. "I've already done it myself. And I know what it doesn't surface, which is any action I took knowingly in furtherance of criminal activity, because I didn't take any." She leaned forward slightly. "What it surfaces is a woman who was kept in the dark by someone who believed he was protecting her, and who has spent the last week building the prosecution package that will take down the thing he built, because it's the right thing to do and because she is very, very tired of other people making decisions about her life." Something moved in Maddox's face. Not sympathy, or not only sympathy, recognition. The particular quality of one woman looking at another woman who was burning a very large structure down around herself because the structure had been built without her consent. "I need the fragments," Maddox said. "I have 3. The other 2 are held by Judge Harold Crane and the director of Sentinel Group, a man named Paul Ashford. Both have been warned that someone is coming for them. Both will require—" "I know who Harold Crane is." Maddox's voice had shifted. Still controlled, but underneath it something had sharpened into a different register entirely. "He's been on our peripheral radar for 14 months. We haven't been able to establish the connection." "The connection is your contractor channel. Webb brokered the relationship. Crane has been providing case scheduling intelligence. He knew which federal dockets had sealed filings related to the network, and adjusted his own case calendar to create conflicts that delayed cross-referencing. She paused. He's been doing it for 7 years. The record is in the fragment he holds because my father built the record to document exactly that relationship as insurance against Crane moving against him. Maddox sat back. For the first time in their conversation, something had shifted in her posture. A micro-movement, the adjustment of someone absorbing a weight they hadn't expected. Your father, she said slowly. Richard Cross. Financial architect for the Valenti organization for 20 years. I found out 8 days ago. Vivian held the eye contact steadily. You'll need to know that. It will be part of the disclosure review, and I'd rather you hear it from me. A long pause. How do we get the fragments from Crane and Ashford? Maddox said. You move on Crane through his judicial conduct exposure. The scheduling manipulation gives you a federal obstruction angle that doesn't require the network connection to establish, which means you can move fast and he won't have time to destroy the fragment before you have a warrant on his records. She had worked this out in the car on the way to Pilsen. She had been working it out since she sat in Damien's study 4 nights ago. Ashford is harder. Sentinel Group has federal contract protections that create procedural barriers. But Ashford's exposure runs through the web connection, and if you move on Webb first and offer him the contractor liability as leverage, he flips on Ashford. Webb is a lawyer, she said. He will absolutely flip on Ashford. Maddox looked at the table between them. She picked up her glass and set it down without drinking from it. If I move on Webb tonight, she said, the network knows within hours. Whatever protection has been keeping you and whatever protection has been in place, it is gone. I know. You'll be exposed. Fully. I know. Are you prepared for that? Vivian thought about the warehouse, the north wall coming in, the floor against her cheek, and the dust that tasted like concrete, and the sound going out like a light. She thought about Damien's hand finding her arm in the dark, the certainty of it, the 4 years of accumulated knowledge that lived in that grip. She thought about her father in his quiet office in Evanston, building something monstrous with careful hands and dying clean while other people carried what he'd built. She was done with other people carrying things that belonged to her. I'm prepared, she said. Maddox nodded once. She reached into her coat and produced a card. Not a business card, a blank card with a number handwritten on it in blue ink, and slid it across the table. Call this in 2 hours. Ask for the number to be read back to you, and if it's wrong, hang up and run. She stood. If it's right, tell me where the fragments are and we move tonight. She walked out of the bar without looking back. Vivian sat with the card in her hand and the untouched drink in front of her, and the noise of the room moving around her, and she thought about what 2 hours meant. 2 hours while Maddox moved pieces into position. 2 hours while the network's surveillance picked up whatever it was going to pick up. 2 hours in which the balance that had been Damien's operational foundation for 4 years would begin to give way under the pressure of what she had just set in motion. She picked up the prepaid phone and called the contingency location. Damien answered on the first ring. It's moving, she said. Tonight. I need you to get the 3 fragments to a location I'm going to give you in the next 10 minutes. No intermediaries. You personally. A pause. You went to Maddox, he said. Yes. Another pause. She waited. The Kessler Group has people outside this building, he said. I made them about 40 minutes ago. 3 vehicles. They're not moving yet, but they're positioned. She felt the cold thing settle further in her chest. The functional thing. The thing that had been building since she sat in his study 4 nights ago and understood that the floor was not what she had believed it was. Can you get out? Yes, but not without them knowing I'm moving. Then let them know, she said. Give them something to follow. I need you at the freight terminal on the South Branch in 45 minutes. The one in the Valenti logistics records, the one with the secondary access from the riverside. Vivian, the terminal, 45 minutes. Bring the fragments. She paused. And Damien, bring Carver and whoever else Carver can move in that time. Because when Maddox executes the web warrant, every party in this city who has a stake in the network's survival is going to understand that the end game has started, and they will all move at once, and I need us to be somewhere that isn't where they expect us to be. She could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. She could hear, in the quality of the silence around that breathing, a man recalibrating everything. The terminal, he said finally. 45 minutes. She hung up. She put the card in her coat pocket next to the prepaid phone, and she left the bar and walked out into the cold Chicago night, and the city was exactly what it always was. Indifferent, continuous, burning with its own particular light. And she walked to her car and got in and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. She thought about the legal pad, about the map she had built over 72 hours in a silent office with cold coffee and the specific quality of focus that came from having no alternative to clarity. She thought about the shape she had found in the problem, the shape that was not comfortable but was the shape that worked. It was working now. She started the engine. The freight terminal sat along the south branch of the river in a district that the city's economic recovery had not reached and showed no signs of reaching, a stretch of industrial infrastructure in various stages of managed decline, loading docks and rail spurs and warehouse structures that still functioned because the city's actual logistical needs were less photogenic than its development brochures. The Valenti logistics operation had run legitimate freight through this terminal for 20 years, using it as one of several surface businesses that provided both revenue and operational cover, and it was the kind of location that appeared in records as exactly what it was, a freight terminal, which made it, paradoxically, less visible than a location that tried to look like something other than what it was. She arrived first and went in through the riverside access and stood in the cold interior of the main loading floor, which was the size of a city block and smelled of diesel and rust and the particular cold that accumulated in large, unheated spaces and became its own kind of presence. The ceiling was a lattice of steel I-beams 40 feet up. The floor was concrete scarred by decades of pallet jacks and forklift traffic. Along the far wall, a bank of windows looked out over the river, black and moving in the night, carrying the city's reflection in pieces. She checked the 2-hour mark on her phone. 90 minutes remaining. She heard the vehicles outside, 2 of them, the sound of engines and then the sound of doors, and then footsteps on the concrete, and Damien came through the north entrance with Carver 2 steps behind him and 2 other men she didn't know flanking them, and she could see from the way Damien was moving that the 45 minutes since they'd spoken had not been quiet. He had blood on his coat, new blood, not the dried stripe from the warehouse, fresh. "The Kessler vehicles followed you," she said. 2 of them. We lost them on the expressway." He reached the center of the floor and stopped in front of her. His face in the half-light of the terminal's emergency lighting was the face she had been reading for 4 years. And underneath the surface, in the places she could now read that she hadn't been able to read before, it was the face of a man who had been in motion for a long time and was beginning to feel the cost of it in his body. "The fragments," she said. He reached into his coat and produced a hard case, the kind used for small electronics, foam-lined combination lock. He held it out to her. She took it. "All 3, he said. She looked at the case in her hands. 30 years of her father's careful construction, reduced to 3 data drives in a foam-lined case, and somewhere in the city, a federal judge and a private intelligence director, each holding the pieces that would complete it, both of them now aware that the end game had started. She looked up at Damien. "When Maddox moves on Webb," she said, "Ashford at Sentinel will know within minutes. He has the 5th fragment, and he will destroy it before she can get a warrant executed." "I know. Which means we need the 5th fragment before she moves." Damien looked at her steadily. "Ashford's primary residence is in Lincoln Park," he said. "He maintains a secondary property in Wilmette." He paused. "The fragment is not at either location." "Where is it?" "Ashford gave it to a custodian. Someone outside the network, outside Sentinel. Someone with no visible connection to any of this. A holding arrangement, so that if Ashford is ever compromised, the custodian releases the fragment to a specified party." He looked at her. "The specified party is the Kessler organization." The terminal was very quiet around them. "He built a dead man's switch," she said. "Yes. If we move on Ashford, the fragment goes to the Kessler group automatically." "Yes." She looked at the case in her hands. She looked at the river through the bank of windows. She looked at Damien's face. "Who is the custodian?" she said. Damien was quiet for a moment that had the specific quality of a door being held shut for the last time, a man using the last of something. "His name is Father." He stopped, corrected himself. His name is Thomas Reardon. He's a retired archivist. He lives in Hyde Park. He has no idea what he's holding. She thought about an innocent man in Hyde Park holding a piece of something he didn't understand, holding it as a dead man's switch for a private intelligence director who had spent 7 years helping a federal judge corrupt the justice system. She thought about what it would take to reach him before Maddox moved on Webb. She looked at her phone, 73 minutes to the 2-hour mark. "I need a car," she said. Something not connected to anything. "Vivian, I need a car, and I need 40 minutes, and I need you to hold this position until I'm back." She looked at him with the full weight of what she had been building towards since she sat in his study 4 nights ago and understood that the floor was gone. "Can you hold this position?" He looked at her, the blood on his coat, the cut still tacky along his hairline. The eyes of a man who had spent 4 years trying to dismantle something from the inside and had watched it accelerate past his control in the last 48 hours. "Yes," he said. She turned to Carver. "The car." Carver produced a key. She was already moving toward the door when the sound came. Not an explosion this time. Nothing as blunt as the warehouse had been. A single sharp report from somewhere outside the north entrance, and then the particular silence that followed a shot. And then Carver's 2 men were moving toward the entrance with their hands inside their coats, and Damien's hand was on her arm, pulling her back and behind him in a single movement that had no deliberation in it, only instinct. "Position," Damien said to Carver. 1 word. And Carver was already gone, moving toward the terminal's upper-level access, and the 2 men had split at the north entrance, and the terminal that had been cold and still 30 seconds ago was now a different kind of still. The kind with vectors, within angles, with the specific held quality of a space in which multiple people were calculating simultaneously what the next 30 seconds would require of them. Vivian pressed herself against the concrete pillar Damien had pulled her behind, and she could feel her own pulse in her throat, fast and hard, and she made herself breathe through it. In for 4, out for 4, the mechanical discipline of a body that needed to function past what it was feeling. A second shot, closer. It hit the steel beam above the north entrance, and the ring of it traveled the length of the terminal like a struck bell. "Sniper," Damien said. Low. Right against her ear. 1 position, north roofline of the adjacent structure. Kessler. Or Ashford's people. Doesn't matter right now. It didn't matter right now. She filed it. "The river exit," she said. "Covered. I saw a vehicle on the south bank when we came in." She looked at the case in her hands. 3 fragments. The terminal around them. 71 minutes to the 2-hour mark when she was supposed to call Maddox and either confirm or run. "Carver," Damien said toward the upper level, not loud. "Upper east window. 1 shooter, single position, bolt action. Not a team entry. Containment only." Carver's voice came down from the steel lattice above them, unhurried, the voice of a man reading a situation he had read versions of before. "They want us in place. They're waiting for something." Waiting for something. She thought about what they were waiting for. She thought about Ashford and the dead man's switch, and the Kessler organization as the specified release party for the 5th fragment. She thought about a retired archivist in Hyde Park who had no idea what he was holding. "They don't want us dead," she said. "Not yet. They want to know if Maddox moves. If she moves on Webb before they have the complete fragment set, the switch triggers, and the Kessler group receives the 5th piece. That gives them the complete record. That gives them everything my father built, used as a weapon against everyone, including the federal investigation itself." She looked at Damien. "They're using us as an indicator. When we stop being contained is when they'll know the federal move has started." Damien looked at her. In the dark of the terminal behind the pillar, with the cold off the river, moving through the broken north entrance seal and the blood drying on his coat, he looked at her with something that had no performance in it at all. "The archivist," he said. "I need that car." He reached into his coat, produced the key Carver had handed her and that she had dropped when he pulled her back. He pressed it into her hand. "River dock," he said. "Southeast corner. It puts you out 2 blocks south." He closed her fingers around the key. "Vivian." She looked at him. "Come back," he said. She held his eyes for 1 second. 1 full second of everything they were to each other, the real version, the one that existed underneath all the architecture of deception and protection and inherited damage that they were in the process of burning down together. Then she moved. The river dock was a platform of wet concrete and iron cleats that smelled of cold water and diesel and the particular organic decay of things that lived at the waterline. And the car Carver had staged there was a dark sedan with no distinguishing features and a full tank, and she was inside it and moving before the sound of the terminal had fully left her ears. She drove south first, then east, cutting through streets that ran parallel to the main arterials, staying in the secondary grid where cameras were fewer and traffic thinner and the city presented its less observed face. The blocks between the blocks, the Chicago that existed in the gaps between the Chicago that appeared in photographs. She had learned this city in 11 years of practice, learned it the way a lawyer learned it, which was from the inside out, from the cases that took her into its least photogenic corners, and she used that knowledge now with the cold efficiency of someone spending a resource they had been saving without knowing they were saving it. Hyde Park was 30 minutes south in ordinary traffic. She had 38 minutes before the 2-hour mark. She drove. Thomas Reardon lived in a courtyard building on a tree-lined street 4 blocks from the university. The kind of building that had been constructed in the 1920s with the assumption that permanence was an achievable quality in physical structures, and had spent the decades since making a reasonable argument for that assumption. She found the address from the information Damien had given her, a street and a unit number, enough. And she parked on the cross street and sat for 30 seconds looking at the building's entrance. No vehicles she didn't recognize, no positioned figures, no quality of watchfulness in the street around it that she had begun, in the last 72 hours, to identify as a specific sensory register. The way watched spaces had a different texture than unwatched ones, a held quality, a two-stillness. The street was ordinary. She got out of the car. The building's lobby was unlocked, the inner door on a buzzer system. She found Reardon's unit number and pressed the button and waited. Pressed it again. She could hear faintly the sound of movement inside. The slow, deliberate movement of someone older, navigating a space at the pace of accumulated years. The intercom crackled. "Who's there?" A man's voice, 70s, she estimated. Alert despite the hour, it was past midnight, but not alarmed. The voice of someone who had trained themselves out of alarm over a long life and replaced it with measured assessment. "My name is Vivian Cross," she said. "I'm an attorney. I need to speak with you about something you were given to hold. I need 5 minutes, and I need them now." A pause. "It's after midnight," he said. "I know. I'm sorry. 5 minutes." Another pause. Longer. Then the inner door buzzed open. Thomas Reardon was a small man, slight in the way of people whose bodies had been compact all their lives and had simply become more so with time, with white hair cut close and hands that were steady and eyes that were the particular clear gray of someone who had spent a professional lifetime looking at documents and had developed a precise relationship with what he saw. He was wearing a robe over pajamas, and he had reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he looked at her in the doorway of his apartment with the assessing quality of a man who had learned not to decide things before he had the relevant information. He looked at the cut on her face. "Come in," he said. She came in. The apartment was the apartment of a man who had given his life to the organization of other people's information, books on every horizontal surface, organized by a system that was visible as a system, without being immediately legible as to its logic, papers in careful stacks, a desk that held both a very old typewriter and a very new laptop as though the transition between them was still in negotiation. She sat in the chair he indicated, and he sat across from her and waited. "A man named Paul Ashford gave you something to hold," she said. "He may have framed it as a professional favor, an archival matter, something within your area of expertise. It would have been a data storage device, a drive, with instructions about its release." Reardon looked at her without expression. "I'm not here to take it from you," she said. "I'm here to tell you what it is so that you can make an informed decision about what you do with it. Because right now you're holding, without knowing it, a piece of evidence in a federal criminal matter, and the man who gave it to you has structured its release in a way that would deliver it to an organized crime family if certain conditions are triggered, and those conditions may be triggered in the next hour." The apartment was quiet. A clock somewhere on a shelf marked the seconds. Ashford told me it was business records, Reardon said. Sensitive commercial material. Attorney-client protected. It's not. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the doorway, assessing, precise, taking the full measure of what was in front of him. You have identification, he said. She produced her bar card. He examined it. He handed it back. What do you need? He said. I need you to not release the drive to the party specified in Ashford's instructions. I need you to transfer it instead to the U.S. Attorney's Office, Organized Crime and Racketeering Division, under the name Assistant U.S. Attorney Claire Maddox. Tonight, if you're willing. If not tonight, then first thing in the morning before any other contact reaches you, and I need you to not answer your door or your phone until then. Reardon was quiet for a moment. If Ashford's instructions are not followed, he said slowly, there may be consequences for me. There may be, she said. She didn't soften it. She had not, in 11 years of practice, learned to soften the true shape of things to make them easier to accept, because that kindness always cost more than it saved. I won't tell you there won't be. What I will tell you is that following them will make you party to the obstruction of a federal investigation into criminal activity that has been running in this city for 30 years. And that Ashford, when the federal move happens, which is tonight, will not be in a position to deliver on whatever he offered you in exchange for this arrangement. Reardon looked at his hands. He turned them over once, the gesture of a man examining something he held. Then he stood up. He went to the desk. He opened a locked drawer with a key from the pocket of his robe, and he removed a small envelope, and from the envelope a data drive. And he set it on the desk in front of her without theatrical weight. Just set it down, the way a careful man set down something he was finished with. I'll need the attorney's contact information, he said. She wrote Maddox's number on a piece of paper from the legal pad she still had in her coat pocket. She set it on the desk next to the drive. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Reardon said. I was deceived. I'm correcting for it. He looked at her steadily. I imagine you understand something about that. She picked up the drive. She was back in the car in 4 minutes. She called the prepaid number for the terminal with 3 minutes to the 2-hour mark, and Damien answered on the first ring, and she said, I have it. Status? Contained. Sniper held position. No entry attempt. A pause. Maddox has been trying to reach the prepaid. She moved earlier than 2 hours. Her stomach dropped. She moved on web. 20 minutes ago. Carver has a contact at the federal building. Another pause, and in it, she heard the quality of a man managing information in real time. Webb is in custody. Maddox executed simultaneously on Crane. They have him at his residence. Ashford's location is currently... Ashford is going to run. He's already running. Carver's contact says federal vehicles are en route to Lincoln Park, and the property is empty. She processed this rapidly. Ashford running meant the dead man's switch was in play. Except the dead man's switch was in her coat pocket. Ashford would reach for it and find it wasn't where he'd left it, and in that moment of confusion, that gap between the trigger pull and the understanding that the mechanism was empty, was the only window available. Call Maddox, she said. The prepaid number she used. Tell her Ashford is mobile, and the 5th fragment is secured, and she needs to close the net on him before he understands why the switch didn't fire. She'll know what that means. Vivian, I'm coming back. Hold the position. She drove. The return to the terminal took 22 minutes through streets that were beginning to thin toward the deepest part of the night, and she pushed the car harder than she had on the way out. And when she came in through the river entrance, the terminal was exactly as she'd left it. Carver above, the 2 men at their angles, Damien at the center of the loading floor standing in the hard pool of emergency lighting like a man who had decided that moving was not the thing required of him and had simply stopped and waited. He turned when he heard her footsteps. She walked to him and held out the drive. He looked at it in her hand. He looked at her face. He didn't take it immediately. He just looked at her for a moment with that quality she had been learning to read, the real version of him that existed underneath the composed surface, the version that had been present in the kitchen at 5 in the morning and in the dark of the terminal earlier and was fully present now. Ashford, he said, running blind. The switch is empty. Maddox is closing on him. Crane. In custody. Webb. In custody. He was quiet. It's done, she said. The financial architecture, the fragments, the web connection to the investigation, the crane obstruction record, it's all going to Maddox tonight. The filing she builds from this won't miss the source. She looked at him steadily. It's done, Damien. Something happened in his face. Not relief, or not simply relief. Something more complex than that. Something that had the quality of a structure under long tension reaching the end of what had been required of it and beginning, slowly, to release. She watched it move through him, and she understood that what she was watching was not the end of something, but the first moment of something the rest of their lives would have to determine the shape of. He took the drive from her hand. Then he took her hand. She let him. The federal operation ran through the night and into the following morning with the particular relentless momentum of a legal mechanism that had been building pressure for 2 years and had finally found the channel it needed. Maddox's team executed 11 warrants before dawn. Ashford was taken at O'Hare at 4:17 in the morning, attempting to board a flight to Zurich with a carry-on that contained, among other items, a laptop and $40,000 in mixed currency, neither of which he would need where he was going. Crane surrendered without incident at his Lincoln Park residence. He was 63 years old and had been a federal circuit judge for 19 of those years, and he surrendered the way men of his particular formation surrendered when the containment finally failed, with a kind of exhausted dignity, the posture of someone who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had simply set it down. Webb refused to speak without counsel, which was his right, and which Maddox had anticipated, and which did not materially affect the evidentiary weight of what she had been handed. The 5 fragments of Richard Cross's insurance document, assembled for the first time in the 30 years since he had distributed them, constituted a documentary record of organizational architecture and financial movement and institutional corruption that was, in the assessment of the 3 federal prosecutors who reviewed it, in the 6 hours after Vivian delivered the case to Maddox's office at 2 in the morning, the most comprehensive single evidentiary package any of them had encountered in their careers. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of enough that left no room for the exits that men like the ones it documented had spent decades constructing. Vivian sat in a conference room at the federal building from 2 until 7 in the morning, answering questions. Not as a suspect. Maddox had been precise about that, had established the framework correctly from the beginning, but as the legal architect of the submission, as the attorney of record for the evidentiary package, in a capacity that was unconventional and would require subsequent review and created professional complications that she had acknowledged and accepted and was prepared to navigate. She answered every question. She disclosed everything. Her marriage, her father, the 7 years of surveillance she had not known about, the ways in which her professional life had been adjacent to the network's operations without her knowledge, and the specific documented reasons why adjacency was not complicity. She laid it out with the same cold structural clarity she had used in 11 years of prosecution work, and she watched the 3 federal prosecutors across the table from her absorb it, and she watched Maddox watch her, and she said nothing she could not support and omitted nothing that was required. At 6:45 in the morning, Maddox walked her out to the building's entrance. They stood at the top of the steps in the early gray light, the city beginning its morning sequence around them, traffic thickening, the lake visible at the end of the cross street as a pale shimmer at the edge of the world. "Your bar license," Maddox said. "I know. Review process will take months. The outcome isn't guaranteed." "I know that too." Maddox looked at her, the clear-eyed look of one professional examining another after a long night, the assessment stripped of anything unnecessary. "You knew when you walked into that bar what it would cost you," Maddox said. "The license, the career as you've built it, everything connected to your position in this city." "Yes." "Why?" Vivian looked at the street, at the city doing what the city did, indifferent and continuous and lit with its own exhausting energy. "Because my father spent 20 years building something that hurt people," she said, "and then he distributed the evidence of it as insurance for himself and died clean. And someone had to finish what he left unfinished." She paused. "I'm a lawyer. Finishing what's unfinished is what I do." Maddox nodded once. She put out her hand. Vivian shook it. She walked down the steps and into the morning. She found Damien at the contingency location. a safe house in Bridgeport that Carver had maintained for situations that required it, a two-flat on a residential street that looked like every other two-flat on the street and contained, in its upper unit, the specific spare functionality of a space built for temporary use by people in complicated circumstances. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee and the prepaid phone on the table beside it, and the look of a man who had been awake all night and had stopped fighting that fact and simply inhabited it. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her face, the cut, the exhaustion, the particular quality of someone who had spent 6 hours in a federal building answering the questions required to dismantle the last 30 years. "Maddox," he said, "it's filed. All 5 fragments. The full financial architecture. Webb, Crane, Ashford, the contractor network, the Kessler Group's documented relationships with the federal investigation." She sat down across from him. "It's all filed." He wrapped both hands around the mug. He looked at the table between them. "The organization," he said. "What remains of the legitimate structures will be subject to civil forfeiture proceedings over the next 18 months. I've structured the evidentiary submission to distinguish between the criminal operation and the legitimate holdings wherever that distinction exists and is supportable." She paused. "It's the best I could do. It's more than I had any right to ask for." "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked up at her. In the ordinary kitchen light of a safe house in Bridgeport at 7 in the morning, with the coffee going cold between them and the city outside moving into its day, she looked at the man she had married and understood him. Finally, with a completeness she had not had before. Not the idealized understanding of a woman in love, not the fractured understanding of a woman who had discovered she had been living inside a deception, but the full, clear, costly understanding of someone who had looked at all of it, the darkness and the love and the damage and the 40 years of consequences, and had decided to see it as what it actually was. It was not simple. It would never be simple. There were things he had done that did not resolve into anything clean, that would sit between them as permanent facts of the landscape they shared, requiring navigation rather than resolution. She was not the woman she had been 9 days ago when she walked into his study and opened a folder she should have closed. She was something that hadn't had a name for itself yet. She was, she thought, the person who came after. "Your license," he said. "Possibly suspended, possibly revoked. I don't know yet." She looked at him steadily. "I'll find out." "What do you want to do?" She thought about that. She thought about what she wanted, which was a question that had not been the organizing question of her life for 11 years. The organizing question of her life for 11 years had been what needed to be done, what the case required, what the evidence supported, what the next right move was in a sequence that always had a next right move if you were willing to go far enough into the problem to find it. She was tired of next right moves. She was tired in a way that lived in her skeleton. "I want to sleep for 12 hours, she said, "and then I want to think about what comes next without someone else's plan being what I'm thinking inside of." He nodded. She looked at him. "You need to go," she said. "You know that." He was quiet for a moment. "The federal filing," he said. "My name is in it. Yes, in the context I told you it would be in, the distinction between inheritance and construction, the documented 4 years of dismantling, the cooperation that produced the evidentiary submission. Maddox understands the distinction. Whether a jury will is a different question." She paused. "Your best outcome is a negotiated arrangement. Maddox would be open to it, given what you provided. I'm not interested in a negotiated arrangement that involves testimony against the people who worked for me." "I know." She had known that. She had built around it. "There is another option. It requires you to not be in this city, not be in this country, for a period of time that is not defined." He looked at her. "Not defined," he said slowly. "Maddox is not interested in spending federal resources pursuing a man who handed her the most significant organized crime prosecution in a decade and whose operational role was primarily one of containment and dismantling. She is interested in closing the cases she can close and building her record on what she has." Vivian held his eyes. "She did not tell me to tell you this. She told me she would not look for what she was not required to look for. I'm telling you what that means." He was still for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere outside, a truck moved through the street, the sound of it coming and going. "Where?" he said. I don't know yet. She looked at her hands on the table. That's something we would have to figure out. The words settled in the space between them. The weight of it, the particular weight of a first-person plural pronoun used by a woman who had spent 9 days dismantling everything she thought she knew about her life and had arrived here, at this kitchen table, with it still in her mouth. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the terminal before she ran for the river exit, the real version, the one with no surface on it. You don't have to, he said. I know. After everything, I know what I'm saying. She looked at him. I know exactly what I'm saying, Damien. I have spent 9 days with everything you are and everything you've done laid out in front of me, and I have looked at all of it, and I am still sitting at this table. She paused. That is a choice I am making with complete information. For the first time in our relationship, I have complete information. Do you understand the difference? He understood the difference. She could see that he understood it. Yes, he said. She stood up from the table. She picked up the prepaid phone. I need to sleep, she said. When I wake up, we'll talk about where. She walked to the bedroom at the end of the hall, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she took off her shoes, and she lay down on top of the covers in her coat, and she was asleep in the time it took her to close her eyes. She slept for 14 hours. 6 months later, a city that had watched Damien Valenti's name move through federal filings and press coverage, and the complicated aftermath of an organized crime prosecution that had reached into judges' chambers and intelligence contractors, and 3 decades of Chicago's financial architecture, received the official confirmation that the proceedings had concluded, the civil forfeiture was complete, and the principal figure of the Valenti organization had died during the period of the syndicate's collapse. The details unspecified. The documentation filed through channels that did not require elaboration. The case closed with the particular administrative finality of things the city was prepared to stop looking at. Vivian had filed the paperwork herself. She had done it from a kitchen table in a house near the water, in a place that was not Chicago, on a morning that was clear and cold and smelled of salt and pine and the specific quality of air that existed in places that had not been asked to be anything other than what they were. She had done it with the methodical care she brought to everything she filed, checking each document, verifying each reference, making sure that what was submitted was exactly what was intended and nothing more. When she was finished, she closed the laptop and sat for a while with the finished quality of it. The kitchen was a good kitchen. It was the kind of kitchen that had been used for actual cooking by people who cared about the result. Scarred wooden countertops and a window above the sink that looked out onto the water, and deep shelves where things were stored according to a logic that was still being established. Because they had only been here 4 months, and the logic of a shared space took time to develop, required the accumulation of ordinary days before it revealed its own pattern. They were accumulating ordinary days. It was strange work, stranger than she had anticipated, and she had anticipated it being strange. She had spent 11 years organized around the next case, the next filing, the next sequence of moves in a problem that always had a next move. And the absence of that structure was not simply an absence. It had a presence of its own, a shape, a demand. She was learning to be in it without immediately converting it into something purposeful, which was harder than any case she had ever taken to trial and produced less visible result and was, she suspected, the actual work of what came after. She had her license. The review had taken 4 months and had concluded with a formal reprimand and a 2-year probationary period, and the specific finding that no conduct in violation of professional ethics had been established. She had read the finding in a room by herself, and had sat with it for a while, and had felt something she did not have a clean name for. Not vindication, because vindication implied a claim she hadn't made, and not relief, because relief implied she had been uncertain, and she had not been uncertain about what she knew she had, and had not done. Something quieter. The particular settling of a thing that had been in question coming to rest. She had cried briefly. Then she had made coffee. She was building towards something new. The shape of it was not yet clear. She had contacts. She had expertise. She had a relationship with Maddox that had survived everything and hardened into something more durable than professional respect. And there was work available in that direction, the kind of work that operated at the intersection of legal architecture and institutional accountability, the kind that required someone willing to go into the ugly rooms and stay there until the thing broke open. She was good at that. She had always been good at that. She would find the work. The work would find her. She was not worried about the work. She heard the door open behind her. Damien came in from outside with the particular quality of cold that attached itself to people who had been walking near the water, and he went to the counter and poured coffee with the deliberate, unhurried process he always applied to that particular ritual, and she watched him do it from the kitchen table and thought about the photograph. He had given it to her 3 weeks after they arrived here. She had not asked for it. He had simply produced it one evening, a plain envelope, set it on the table in front of her without preamble or ceremony. She had opened it, her own face at 17 looking down at something in her hands on an ordinary afternoon outside her father's house. The photograph taken from a distance by a man who had found her through the thread of her father's damage and had intended something very different from what had happened. She had turned it over. The handwriting on the back was his. She recognized it, the particular careful quality of a man who wrote as he did everything else, with deliberate economy. The ink was old, faded at the edges, the writing of a younger version of him, a man in his mid-20s standing at the beginning of a plan that would consume the next decade of his life and then become something else entirely. I was supposed to destroy the daughter of my enemy. Instead, she became the only reason I wanted to save myself. She had sat with it for a long time. Then she had put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, where it had been since, and she had not told him she kept it there, and he had not asked. And the not asking was itself a form of understanding she was still learning the dimensions of. He turned from the counter and looked at her at the kitchen table with the closed laptop and the finished quality she was still sitting inside. "Done," he said. "Done." He brought his coffee to the table and sat across from her, and they were quiet for a while in the way they had learned to be quiet. Not the performed quiet of two people managing their distance, but the real kind. The kind that two people built out of ordinary accumulated time. The kind that had its own texture and temperature and required nothing from either of them except their presence inside it. Outside the window, the water moved. The light was the winter kind, low and clear and precise, the kind that showed the actual shape of things without flattering them. And it lay across the water and across the kitchen table and across the faces of two people who had come through something that had cost them everything they thought they had and were sitting in the aftermath of it with the specific quality of people who had paid the cost and were still there. Vivian looked at the window, at the water, at the winter light that showed the actual shape of things. She thought about her father. She thought about the careful hands that had built something monstrous, and the ordinary Tuesday afternoon she had stood on the sidewalk outside his house, not knowing any of it, and she thought about the things a daughter could and could not choose about what she inherited. She had not chosen this. None of it. Not the history, not the damage, not the plan that had been built around her existence before she understood her own life. But she had chosen what she did with it, in the end, with complete information, at a kitchen table in Bridgeport at 7 in the morning. And she had chosen it again at a federal building with her professional life on the table. And she was choosing it now, this quiet, this kitchen, this man sitting across from her with his coffee and his particular stillness, this ordinary morning that belonged to neither of their families' pasts. That was the thing about what came after. You chose it. Every day, in the small accumulating decisions that made a life, you chose it. There was no moment when the choosing was finished. She reached across the table and wrapped her hands around her own mug. The water moved outside. The light held.